In the bitter winter of 1887, Scotland Yard locked away a case file that would remain a secret for more than 90 years. A dossier detailing 7 horrific murders that shook the wealthy Belgravia district for 8 months. Each victim was discovered with the same strange carving cut into their chest and an unknown residue that left their faces frozen in grotesque laughter. What horrified the public even more was not only the ritualistic cruelty, but the fact that neighbors swore they heard chilling laughter echoing from the houses of the dead long after the police surgeon had confirmed they were gone. The investigation ended abruptly when Inspector Edmund Harwick, the lead detective, disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a single cryptic note that read, "The laughter never stops. It follows you home." Before we continue with this disturbing story of one of London's darkest mysteries, be sure to subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments which city or country you are watching from. Stories like these remind us that darkness hides even in the grandest corners of history. What the authorities buried was not just the proof of a killer's gruesome pattern, but evidence of how far Victorian high society would go to preserve their standing, even if it meant letting a murderer slip silently through the fog-draped streets of the empire. London in 1887 was the proud beating heart of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee that year celebrated her 50 years on the throne with parades and weeks of festivities. The city seemed invincible, its influence stretching from the tea fields of Ceylon to the diamond mines of South Africa. Gas lamps glowed like stars along cobbled streets, throwing restless shadows across the stately Georgian terraces and the towering new Victorian mansions of Britain's industrial elite. The very air carried the empire itself, coal smoke mingling with the salt of the Thames, the steady clatter of hansom cabs on stone, and the endless murmur of a city that never truly slept. By day, merchants, clerks, and household staff hurried about their business, their steps echoing against limestone facades under the pale sky. By night, London transformed into a place of mystery where gaslight spilled in small golden pools and the rest was swallowed by shadow. Belgravia had become the pride of the newly rich, a neighborhood of white stucco townhouses and neat garden squares, a sign of immense taste and fortune. Unlike the old nobility, these were self-made magnates, railroad kings, textile lords, and shipping tycoons who built fortunes out of industry. Their homes, with their pristine fronts, iron balconies, and manicured gardens, stood as monuments to the global reach of Britain. The Harrington family held vast cotton mills in Manchester and Lancashire fortunes, built on the backs of thousands of laborers. Lord Charles Harrington, a stern man with steel-gray whiskers and eyes like knives, paid an enormous £12,000 for his mansion in Belgrave Square, a sum that spoke not only of the building's grandeur, but of the lofty social position it bestowed. Lady Margaret Harrington, 20 years his junior, carried the kind of polished beauty born of privilege, and hosted grand dinners that drew politicians, businessmen, and artists from across the empire. The Cavendish dynasty made millions, importing tea and opium from the East, their clippers flying across the Indian Ocean with precious cargo that packed London's warehouses. The youngest Cavendish brother, Geoffrey, inherited wealth and a passion for art, literature, music, and especially the theater. His home in Chester Square was famous for small salons, where writers, actors, and thinkers debated the latest movements sweeping Europe. The Pemberton fortune came from the deep coal seams of Wales and northern England, their black gold fueling the engines of the age. Lord William Pemberton, despite being born the son of a miner, had remade himself into one of London's most admired businessmen, though his speech still carried the faint marks of his rough beginnings, branding him nouveau riche in the eyes of old aristocrats. For 15 years, Inspector Edmund Harwick patrolled these privileged streets, starting as a beat constable in the dangerous alleys of Whitechapel and rising to become one of Scotland Yard's finest. At 45, he was a meticulous Victorian gentleman, educated in the classics and known among colleagues as a man who could move easily among high society, yet never forgot his roots as the son of a Hampshire blacksmith. Tall, lean, and prematurely gray, he projected authority, yet the calluses on his hands betrayed his working-class youth. His dark eyes had seen the worst of humanity, but they still held the belief that justice could prevail. He lived alone in a modest room on Montague Street near the British Museum. A lifelong bachelor devoted to his work, surrounded by books and occasionally enjoying quiet evenings at the public house with his fellow detectives. That autumn came cruel and early frost clung to Hyde Park in the first week of October, and heavy yellow fog rolled off the Thames, covering the city like a choking shroud. These were no romantic mists, but suffocating pea soupers born from coal smoke and river fog, reducing visibility to a few yards and turning even familiar streets into ghostly labyrinths. On those nights, the gas lamps seemed to hang in empty space, like spirits, their pale glow creating more shadows than light. The steady clip-clop of horses' hooves on the cobblestones would rise suddenly out of the fog, followed by the shadowy outline of a hansom cab appearing like a phantom, before melting back into the gray. It was whispered that one day, Jack the Ripper himself would use these fogs to cloak his horrors in the East End. But those crimes were still nearly a year away. In Belgravia, the wealthy believed themselves secure behind locked doors, guarded by liveried servants, their money and rank a shield from the violence that plagued the poorer districts. That sense of safety born from privilege would prove fatally misplaced, because in these fog-bound streets of Victorian London, death could come in any form, even as laughter echoing, long after its source had fallen silent. October 15th, 1887. The scream that shattered the pre-dawn stillness of Belgrave Square came from Lady Margaret Harrington, who had returned home early from a charity gala at the Royal Opera House, only to find her front door ajar, and the heavy fog spilling through the marble hall like ghostly fingers. That night, the fog was so dense it had transformed familiar streets into a strange new world, where gas lamps gave only small, sickly pools of yellow light, while beyond them, the mist swallowed sound and distance alike. Her cab had been forced to crawl through the gloom, the driver shouting warnings into the murk to unseen traffic. She had left the opera early, pleading a headache when the truth was she had grown tired of the long, droning Wagner performance and the stiff rituals of the gala, an evening meant for the city's elite to preen while donating tokens to charity. She wore her emerald silk gown, the one that made her auburn hair blaze, and her green eyes sparkle in the gaslight, but longed only for the warmth of her drawing room and a proper cup of tea. The ride through the fog took nearly twice as long as usual, as even her experienced driver had to stop twice to study the blurred street signs beneath the dim glow of the lamps. The mist pressed against the windows like a living thing, and she drew her opera cloak tighter around her, while the rhythmic sound of hooves kept her calm. When at last they reached Belgrave Square, Lady Margaret immediately sensed something amiss. Her front door stood slightly open with a slice of golden light spilling out into the swirling green mist. Elena Whitfield, her head housekeeper for 23 years, was known for her strict sense of order and would never have left the house unguarded. Lady Margaret thought at once that perhaps the older woman had fallen ill. Recently, Mrs. Whitfield had seemed distracted, muttering to herself while she worked, and the staff whispered about hearing her talking as if to invisible company. But when questioned, she always smiled and said she was practicing her diction. Climbing the steps in her damp silk slippers, Lady Margaret called out softly, "Elena, are you quite well?" but the fog swallowed her voice. Inside the entrance hall, the gas jets flickered in the draught, casting restless shadows across the marble and the gilt-framed portraits. In the main drawing room, she found Elena Whitfield lying across the Persian carpet, posed with an almost theatrical care. Her silver hair, once pulled tight in a severe bun, was now spread around her head like a halo, every strand carefully arranged. Her rough, hard-working hands were folded neatly across her chest as if for burial. But it was her face that turned the scene from tragedy to nightmare. Her features were frozen in pure, unearthly laughter, mouth open, wide eyes creased with joy, so lifelike that Lady Margaret half expected to hear the beloved sound of her housekeeper's laugh burst from the stillness. The room around her told another story, a story of terrible struggle. Furniture lay overturned. A valuable Chinese vase lay shattered near the hearth, books scattered like fallen leaves. The heavy velvet curtains torn from their hooks, and the delicate porcelain figurines smashed across the sofa cushions. As the fog began to thin, Inspector Harwick arrived at dawn. His tall figure a dark silhouette, his bowler hat and long coat making him seem torn from the pages of a Gothic novel. The scene he found inside was like nothing he had encountered in all his years with Scotland Yard. Mrs. Whitfield's body bore the marks of a vicious fight. Her fingernails broken and packed with her attacker's skin and blood. Deep bruises circling her neck like a grim necklace, and defensive wounds along her arms, showing she had battled fiercely to the end. Yet her face still held that hauntingly joyful expression, as if in her final moment she had witnessed something irresistibly amusing. "Blimey, sir," whispered Constable James Thornbury Harwick's young assistant, his voice shaking as he crouched by the body, clearly shaken by what was the first truly horrific scene of his brief career. Barely 22 and fresh from training, Thornbury was still learning the hard truths of police work in Victorian London. "Look at her face, Inspector. What sort of madman could do such a thing? It is like she died laughing." Harwick studied the room with cold precision, every detail carefully noted in the way only years of experience could teach. Every piece of overturned furniture, every shattered vase, every scattered book spoke of Mrs. Whitfield's last desperate struggle. But it was the strange order imposed after her death that disturbed him most. Her body had been posed with care, her hair arranged like a halo, her hands folded with deliberate gentility. Then there was the small carving just below her left collarbone, a shallow cut forming a mask, half comedy, half tragedy. The same mask that hung over the stages of the West End where London's elite gathered for their beloved plays. It was clean, precise, and clearly made after death, a signature meant to be seen, not a killing blow. What unsettled him even more than the scene itself was the strange scent that filled the drawing room. It was not the stench of death, but a cloying, sweet, almost medicinal smell that reminded him of the ether used at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, but far more complex, layered with chemicals he could not immediately place. Years earlier, he had investigated a disgraced physician who used experimental anesthetics on the poor at Bethlehem Hospital, and this odor brought that case flooding back, though this mixture was far more refined. Whoever had done this possessed knowledge of chemistry and the human body beyond that of an amateur. Lady Margaret Harrington, still wrapped in her opera cloak, sat trembling beside the fire a servant had hastily lit, struggling to maintain the composure demanded by her station. "I returned from the opera shortly after midnight," she said in a hushed voice. "We attended a charity gala and endured a dreadful performance of Wagner's Ring Cycle. I pled a headache and left early just before 11. She dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief bearing her family crest. Elena should have been asleep by 10 as always after locking the doors and extinguishing the lamps. She never wavered from that routine in all her years with us. What Lady Margaret could not explain, and what in the coming days would grow into one of the strangest aspects of the case, was what neighbors claimed to have heard long after midnight. Mrs. Gertrude Pembroke from the house across the square told Harwick that she had distinctly heard a woman's laughter, drifting through the fog, from the Harrington residence sometime after 2 in the morning, hours after the surgeon fixed the time of death at no later than midnight. It was the strangest thing, Inspector, she said when he visited her the next day. A widowed matron in her 60s, Mrs. Pembroke lived alone and suffered chronic sleeplessness. I was reading in my sitting room, she explained, and the fog was so thick that night I could barely see the lamps across the square, but sound carries in such weather. At first I thought Lady Margaret had brought friends home from the gala. But it went on, the same woman's voice laughing again and again for nearly an hour, with such genuine mirth that it almost made me smile, though there was something about it that made me close my curtains and try not to hear. That account became one of the most chilling details of the case. Thus, the first victim was claimed by the figure the penny papers soon named the Laughing Man. And from that moment, Inspector Harwick knew he faced more than a murder. He had stepped into a mystery that mocked science and reason itself. Though the Harringtons tried to contain the scandal, the story spread like fire through the drawing rooms and private clubs of London. Within days, Belgravia whispered of nothing else, every retelling adding wilder speculation, while the Times limited itself to a discreet notice about an unfortunate domestic death in Belgrave Square, buried on page 6 between ads for patent medicines. But the penny papers reveled in every grisly rumor, turning the tragedy into a Gothic nightmare that seized the imagination of the city. The Illustrated Police News wasted no time turning the murder into a sensation, filling its front page with a lurid woodcut and the headline, "Mysterious Death in Belgravia, Servant Found with Ghastly Smile." Though the details of the drawing were wildly inaccurate, the image captured just enough of the crime's eerie nature to burn the case into the public's imagination. For Inspector Harwick, however, the reality behind the spectacle was a far more dangerous challenge. He now had to balance the politics of Victorian society with his duty to justice. The Harrington family wielded enormous power. Lord Charles Harrington held a seat in the House of Lords, vast investments in the railways, and friendships with men who could end a policeman's career with a word. A single misstep could ruin him. Yet Harwick's principles, forged in 15 years of work in London's darkest corners, demanded a full and honest investigation. He had seen too many crimes buried under privilege, and was determined that Mrs. Whitfield's murder would not be another. His early inquiries into her past revealed an extraordinary life. Born Elelena Caldwell in a Yorkshire village, she had come to London at 18, and through intelligence and hard work, risen from scullery maid to head housekeeper, a position she had held for over 2 decades. Among the servants, she was spoken of with deep respect. Sarah Pembroke, the timid young scullery maid, still pale from finding her superior's body, whispered that Mrs. Whitfield had been firm, but fair never harsh without reason, and always willing to teach those who wished to learn. Thomas Hartwell, the dignified family butler, described her as the very soul of the household. She knew every inch of the Harrington home, he told Harwick. Every piece of silver, every family tradition. Lady Margaret relied on her completely, as did Lord Charles. She was more than a servant, she was the heart of this house. Yet, even this steadfast woman had changed in the weeks before her death. More than one servant described hearing her speaking at length to herself, holding entire conversations in empty rooms. Sarah explained how she often put on different voices and accents, sometimes sounding like a refined lady. other times like a rough laborer, or even in an Irish or Scottish lilt. It made us laugh. She admitted she had such a way of turning the chores into a little performance. This connection to the theater was one detail Harwick could not ignore, especially with the carved mask on her chest and the unnatural expression of laughter frozen on her face. Slowly, he began to see a possible link forming between the crime and the world of the stage. Determined to follow this lead, Harwick extended his investigation into London's theatre district. In 1887, the West End was a close world of actors, playwrights, and managers who thrived on gossip. The Grand Lyceum under Henry Irving drew the highest society, while newer playhouses like the Savoy were pushing boundaries with electric lighting and bold new productions. It was in these circles that Harwick first heard of an unsettling figure who had begun appearing in the theaters. A gentleman always impeccably dressed, who came alone and never spoke to anyone yet, whose presence was memorable for one reason. He laughed. He laughed during tragic scenes at death, madness, and sorrow, as though they delighted him. Several managers had received complaints about this strange spectator. "Gave me the shivers, something awful," said Albert Grimby, manager of the Lyceum, as he walked Harwick through the silent theater on a gray November afternoon. "This fellow sat in the same box 3 nights in a row for our production of Macbeth. Each time someone died, each time Lady Macbeth descended into madness, he would start laughing like it was the finest joke he had ever heard. Not the restrained chuckle or genteel applause of polite society, you understand, but full booming belly laughter that rolled through the entire theater." Grimby paused, clearly unsettled even weeks later by the memory. Patrons began to complain, saying it ruined the performance. Mr. Irving himself noticed from the stage and was furious at the disruption. We finally had to ask the gentleman not to return, though he accepted the request, with surprising good humor, telling us he understood completely and even praised the production for its authentic portrayal of mortality's absurdity. Those were his exact words, Inspector, not the sort of thing one expects from an ordinary patron. Yet when Harwick pressed for a detailed description, the accounts conflicted. Some described a tall man with dark hair and a fine military mustache, while others swore he was shorter, clean-shaven, and pale like a scholar. The only things every witness agreed on were that he dressed like a man of means. Always in perfect evening attire, seemed intimately familiar with the plays, as if he knew the scripts by heart and laughed in ways no normal man would at scenes of tragedy, fear, or heartbreak. 3 weeks after the murder of Mrs. Whitfield, as the winter fog thickened and the city's lamps burned weakly against the encroaching dark, the killer struck again. This time, the victim was Mr. Geoffrey Cavendish, younger brother of the famed tea importing family. His body was discovered in the private study of his Chester Square home under circumstances that were both similar to and unlike the first crime. It was his new manservant, William Hartley, who made the discovery. Arriving as usual at 7 to light the fires and prepare breakfast, he found the study door locked and no answer to his knocking. After the cook summoned a locksmith and the door was forced open, the sight that met them was one that would never be forgotten. Geoffrey Cavendish sat upright in his large leather armchair, beside the fireplace, wearing his burgundy velvet smoking jacket, his head tilted back and his hands resting neatly on the arms. At first glance he looked asleep, but his face was frozen in that same unnatural mask of ecstatic laughter that mocked death just as it had in the first murder. Unlike the chaos of Mrs. Whitfield's final struggle, the study was perfectly undisturbed. Nothing was out of place. The books lining the tall mahogany shelves stood in precise order, and on his lap rested an open volume of Oscar Wilde's comedies, open to a page of The Importance of Being Earnest. Harwick could not ignore the grim irony, for the passage described Lady Bracknell's advice on maintaining composure in the face of life's hardships. More chilling still were the accounts of the neighbors. Several had been woken during the night by sounds from the Cavendish house. Mrs. Adelaide Peaton, an elderly widow living in the adjoining home, told Harwick the next day that she had heard laughter echoing through the walls well after 3 in the morning hours. After the police surgeon would later confirm Cavendish had died between 10 and 11. "The walls between our houses are very thick, Inspector," she explained as she poured tea with trembling hands. "Built to give families of quality their privacy. Yet I could hear that laughter as clearly as if he were sitting in my own parlor. It went on for hours, not brief amusement, but wave after wave of hysterical mirth, pausing only to begin again with more force. I finally resorted to a sleeping draught around 4, yet still heard it even in my dreams." Harwick's investigation into Geoffrey Cavendish's background revealed a very different world from that of Mrs. Whitfield, making the link between the two deaths all the more strange. Cavendish was a gentleman of independent wealth, a Cambridge graduate who had devoted his life to literature and art after inheriting a fortune from his family's tea business. Unlike his older brother Marcus, who managed the commercial empire, Geoffrey had chosen a path of culture and ideas. He was a familiar figure in London's theatre district, where he supported new playwrights and daring productions. His home in Chester Square was renowned for salons held twice a week, where authors, actors, critics, and intellectuals debated the movements sweeping across Europe. Oscar Wilde himself was a frequent guest, as was George Bernard Shaw, whose work was beginning to challenge the polite illusions of Victorian society. Unmarried and devoted to learning, Cavendish's vast library of more than 3,000 books ranged from the classics to cutting-edge studies of psychology and human behavior. He was well known in his circle for an intense fascination with the new science of psychology, particularly theories on how inner feelings shape outward expressions. Yet no matter how far Inspector Harwick dug, he could not find a natural link between Mrs. Whitfield and Mr. Cavendish. She was a lifetime servant from the working class, while he was a Cambridge-educated patron of the arts and salons. Their lives could not have been more different, and still both died at the hands of the same meticulous figure, both left with that terrible grin, and both somehow laughed on long after life had left their bodies. The case took a shocking turn when Constable Thornbury, eager to prove his worth, while searching the study, noticed a panel behind Cavendish's great desk that sounded hollow. Inside was a hidden compartment containing papers that would blow the case wide open. There was a small leather diary written in Cavendish's precise script, chronicling his deepening obsession with what he called the authentic expression of emotion. The entries across 6 months revealed a man convinced that most displays of feeling were nothing more than masks worn to satisfy the rigid expectations of polite society. One entry from June 3, 1887, stood out. "Attended the Piton dinner this evening. Observed Harrington's housekeeper, a woman of rare theatrical sensibility. While serving, she laughed at a story with a spontaneity entirely absent from the guests. It was utterly genuine and unlike their shallow, polite amusement. I must study her further in more controlled circumstances." Another entry 2 weeks before his death was more ominous. "Have met with Dr. H to discuss our plans. He has agreed to join forces in experiments with chemical agents that induce pure emotion. Early results promising. These compounds may strip away the masks imposed by society. If they succeed, we will finally witness the natural human state in all its truth." And then the final note, just 2 days before he died, chilled Harwick as he read it in the glow of a gas lamp. "The work begins tomorrow. Dr. H has perfected the mixture. I have volunteered to be the first subject, certain that my curiosity will conquer any suffering. Soon we will see what lies beneath the masks all men wear." The words confirmed Cavendish had not been a victim at all, but a volunteer in some hideous experiment gone wrong. But who was Dr. H, and what exactly had they unleashed? If Cavendish had offered himself up, then perhaps Mrs. Whitfield had also been involved in ways still hidden. The masks, the laughing faces, the sounds of mirth long after death, all pointed to someone with mastery of chemistry and a deep knowledge of the human mind. Beneath the diary, Thornbury uncovered a sheaf of letters written in an elegant hand and signed only H. They described formulas and theories on emotion and consciousness. One 3 months old was particularly telling. My dear Cavendish, your views on the false nature of society's emotions confirm my own experiments. The compound I am creating strips away the conditioning that stifles true feeling and allows pure emotion to emerge. But the effects are not fully known. The slightest miscalculation in dosage may have unintended consequences. As Harwick read these pages, a terrible realization settled over him. These deaths were no random killings. They were part of systematic human experimentation. The theater masks, the posed bodies, the laughter were all deliberate symbols chosen to expose the difference between performance and reality. What began as murder had now become something more sinister. If this story chills you, share it with someone who loves dark mysteries and subscribe so you never miss what happens next. From that night onward, Harwick knew he was no longer hunting a simple killer. He was tracking a dangerous visionary, a man using London as his private laboratory, pushing science beyond morality. Following the trail of Cavendish's letters drew him into the underbelly of Victorian London, where science and quackery mingled ambition with madness and discovery with horror. Cavendish had belonged to several learned societies that gathered regularly in the private salons of London's gentlemen's clubs. The Grand Athenaeum Club on Pall Mall, with its neoclassical columns, served as the hub of the Royal Geographical Society and drew the empire's most eminent men of letters and science. But it was the smaller, more specialized circles that caught Inspector Harwick's attention. Groups like the Society for Psychical Research and the London Anthropological Institute debated the latest and most daring theories of human consciousness with passionate fervor. It was within these circles that a name surfaced repeatedly: Sebastian Hartwell, once a promising Harley Street physician who had been stripped of his license 3 years earlier for conducting unauthorized experiments at Bethlehem Royal Hospital, the notorious Bedlam Asylum. Hartwell's fall from grace had been swift and scandalous. Once hailed as one of London's brightest medical minds, known for innovative treatments of nervous disorders, he became consumed with the study of how mental states shaped physical expressions, focusing particularly on the facial muscles that betrayed extreme emotions. His theories had grown darker and more controversial with time, as he became convinced that emotional states could be artificially induced through chemical means. Hartwell was brilliant, but dangerously unrestrained, said Professor Marcus Rothell of University College London when Harwick found him in his paper-strewn office on Gower Street. Rothell, himself a pioneer in the young field of psychology, had studied with Hartwell years before in Edinburgh. He had no limits, no regard for the ethics that bind decent men. He believed progress required experiments that decent society would never allow. Hartwell spoke of devising chemical compounds that could induce pure emotions while leaving the subject awake and aware. And he was especially obsessed with joy, believing genuine happiness to be the hardest emotion to fabricate. His ambition was to create a state of unfiltered, authentic experience, free from the masks of culture. When Harwick attempted to trace him, he discovered that Hartwell had disappeared weeks earlier from his modest rooms in Bloomsbury, leaving behind a disturbing collection of notebooks crammed with anatomical drawings of human faces and formulas meant to alter the nervous system. His landlady, Mrs. Agnes Butterworth, explained that her tenant had been unfailingly polite and prompt with his rent, but spent long nights conducting strange experiments. Sweet, cloying chemical smells would drift through the house at all hours, and she often heard him pacing and declaiming as if practicing speeches or plays. Behind a false wall, Harwick found what remained of his laboratory, a full array of glassware burners, bottles of powders and tinctures, and meticulous notes describing trial after trial on unknown human subjects. One entry made Harwick's blood run cold. Subject displays uncontrollable laughter within 15 minutes. Expression intensifies for 30 minutes, reaching maximum euphoria by 45. Subject remains conscious, unable to control facial muscles or vocalization. Effect continues for 6 hours after death, suggesting impact on the nervous system at a fundamental level. Even as Harwick examined this grim laboratory, reports from Belgravia made the case even more urgent. Several prominent residents had begun to notice signs of intrusion in their homes. Lady Victoria Peaton of Chester Square told him that she had returned from a visit to Brighton to find that her private study had been rifled through. Nothing was missing, but her letters had been disturbed, and several books, specifically those about acting and the expression of emotions, were gone. A similar report came from Lord Hamilton Fairfax, whose library in Eaton Square was one of the finest in the city. The intruder ignored priceless first editions and took only works on psychology, anatomy, and performance. But the most disturbing account came from Mrs. Charlotte Bramwell, a solicitor's widow who lived on Belgrave Square opposite the Harrington Mansion, where the horror had begun. For 2 weeks, she had noticed a tall, well-dressed man watching her house from across the fog-shrouded street. He never approached, only stood in the shadows, disappearing the moment she tried to confront him. He seemed to be studying the house, Inspector Mrs. Bramwell said, her voice trembling with a fear she was trying to hide. Not like a thief looking for a chance, but like a man making deliberate notes, as though I were an insect pinned under a glass. Her description matched those given by the theater managers, who spoke of the strange patron that laughed during tragic performances, a tall, well-dressed gentleman with an air of education and confidence, but with something off in his presence that unsettled everyone around him. That detail tied everything together for Inspector Harwick. Lady Peaton, Lord Fairfax, and Mrs. Bramwell, all three had attended the same lectures on the science of human expression delivered earlier that year at the Royal Institution by Dr. Sebastian Hartwell before the scandal that ruined him. And so too had Mrs. Whitfield and Geoffrey Cavendish. Somehow the housekeeper had found a way to attend, and Cavendish had been one of the most attentive regulars, often staying after to discuss the doctor's theories. Those lectures were advertised as scientific discussions of emotion and behavior, drawing scholars, artists, and socialites from across London. But in truth, they were a trap. Hartwell had been using the series to build a list of subjects for his experiments. He argued to the crowd that nearly every human feeling was just performance, an act put on for society's sake. The only way to understand the truth, he said, was to strip away the mask using chemical means to reach what he called authentic, unfiltered emotion. No one in the audience realized he was outlining experiments he planned to perform on them. The killer's targets were not chosen at random. He was moving carefully through that list, eliminating those who had shown the most interest in his work. As winter fog thickened, turning the streets into a maze of shadows, Harwick realized he was no longer conducting a simple murder investigation. He was trying to stop a man who viewed the city as his private laboratory and its residents as test subjects. Hartwell had been planning for months, carefully studying every potential subject, learning their habits and their weaknesses. The carved masks, the eerie laughter, the corpses frozen in mirth were not theatrical flourishes, but deliberate demonstrations of his theory that society's emotions are false. Each killing was an experiment meant to prove his point. These victims were not stabbed or shot. They were killed by compounds that induced an intense wave of euphoria, powerful enough to overwhelm the body itself. The laughter that echoed long after death was no ghostly phenomenon, but a chemical effect on the nervous system, so strong it lingered even after the heart stopped. Harwick understood now that he faced an adversary who combined the cold focus of a scientist with the madness of a killer. Hartwell was not simply a murderer. He was a researcher using death as data. The breakthrough that finally set Harwick on the right trail came from a frightened medical student named Thomas Whitmore, who had once attended the very same lectures. He had volunteered to help, believing he was contributing to legitimate research into psychology. "I thought it was science," Whitmore said, when at last he came to Scotland Yard after reading about the Cavendish murder. "Hartwell spoke so well about learning the truth of human consciousness, and I felt honored to be included." But it soon became clear these experiments were crossing boundaries no man should cross. From the student, Harwick learned of a hidden laboratory in the basement of an abandoned warehouse by the London docks. There, Hartwell had been perfecting a set of chemical formulas designed to control human emotion. Some created intense fear, others despair. But the one Hartwell prized above all was a compound that produced uncontrollable bliss. He called it the essence of joy and swore it revealed true happiness by cutting away all the masks that people wear. Whitmore's account of the secret warehouse laboratory matched what Inspector Harwick had found in Hartwell's abandoned Bloomsbury rooms, but on a far larger scale. The basement space was fitted with an array of glass retorts and chemical apparatus designed to manufacture compounds in bulk. And there were meticulous ledgers documenting experiments performed on dozens of subjects over several months. Whitmore explained that the early volunteers had been drawn from medical students and the workhouses, persuaded by Hartwell's charisma and credentials that they were contributing to legitimate science, and lured by a few coins for their trouble. As the work grew riskier, Hartwell began turning to unwilling participants, targeting the intellectual and social elite who had attended his lectures at the Royal Institution. These people, he told his followers, would both understand the significance of his research and ensure that the results attracted maximum public attention. Every death was a performance intended to be both a proof and a challenge to the scientific world. This revelation filled Harwick with dread, but also gave him a lead. Whitmore's directions to the Riverside warehouse and his description of Hartwell's routines offered the first real chance of finding him. Days later, on a thick December night, when the fog rolled in from the Thames and the air was filled with the mournful call of ship horns, a boy knocked at Harwick's lodgings with an envelope bearing Hartwell's unmistakable handwriting. Inside was a note written in an elegant, confident hand. "My dear Inspector Harwick, your investigation has been thorough, but you misapprehend the nature of my work. I am no criminal, but a scientist on the verge of a discovery that will transform the understanding of human consciousness. If you would see the final proof of my research, come to the Adelphi Theater at midnight. Come alone and witness what it means to be truly human." It was clearly a trap. But with the investigation stalled and more lives at stake, Harwick had no choice. He armed himself with his revolver, arranged for a team of officers to follow at a discreet distance, and set out into the fog. The theater on the Strand stood dark and silent, its neoclassical columns casting deep shadows in the dim glow of the gas lamps. The stage door was left unlocked, and the detective stepped through deserted halls lined with faded posters. The building breathed with the memories of decades of performances, the boards creaking underfoot, the faint scent of grease paint still clinging to the air. From the main auditorium came voices, not one, but several, drifting faintly through the gloom. Harwick felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he realized Hartwell was not working alone. The stage was lit by a single hard calcium lamp that threw stark shadows across the proscenium. Standing beneath its harsh glow was Dr. Sebastian Hartwell, poised like a professor, addressing an unseen class, and beside him, alive and unrestrained, was Geoffrey Cavendish. The younger Cavendish brother had never been a victim, but a partner in Hartwell's work. Inspector Harwick Hartwell called in a voice as steady as the boards he stood upon, how very punctual. "Do sit at the front. You will want to see everything." His tone was cool, almost welcoming. Tonight marks the culmination of years of research into authentic human emotion. As the detective stood in silence, Hartwell revealed the truth. For over 2 years, he and Cavendish had worked in secret, turning speculation about the artificial nature of emotion into a deliberate program of human experimentation. Cavendish spoke with the calm precision of an academic. "We have created chemical agents that can evoke any emotional state while leaving the subject fully aware." Mrs. Whitfield's death was not a murder in the ordinary sense. She died in a state of unadulterated joy, a state that no civilized mask could touch. Hartwell stepped closer to the footlights. "Every subject has allowed us to chart how true feeling is written on the body. Terror, sorrow, and joy, we have mapped them all, and the continued laughter after death. Inspector is proof that our work touches something deeper than life itself. What you call death is only the beginning of the purest emotion." The mask carved into the victims' chests now made perfect sense to Inspector Harwick. It was the ultimate symbol of Dr. Hartwell's belief that all ordinary human feelings were nothing but acts, a mask society forced people to wear. Only through his chemical methods, Hartwell claimed, could true emotion be torn free of these constraints. "You have made a single and fatal mistake in your investigation." Inspector Hartwell said, his tone like a teacher correcting a pupil. "You assumed our victims were chosen randomly from those who came to hear my lectures. But each one was chosen for a reason. They were the steps that led you here tonight. You were the final subject all along. Every clue, every witness, every lead you thought you discovered was placed to bring you to this stage at this very hour. Your men from Scotland Yard will not be coming," Geoffrey Cavendish added coolly. "We needed someone intelligent, composed, and disciplined for the final experiment, and you were perfect. Your reactions under true fear will complete our work." Hartwell raised a small glass vial, clear liquid glowing faintly in the harsh stage light. "This is the perfection of my research, Inspector. Unlike the formula of joy that freed the others, this will deliver undiluted terror. You will remain fully aware and conscious while fear strips you of all control. Your death will complete the final stage of our work." As the two men advanced, Harwick appeared to yield, but inside was ready for his only chance. Hidden in his pocket was a small polished mirror he carried on surveillance work. When Hartwell came close, he pulled it out and turned it into the glare of the calcium lamp. The blinding white light struck them full in the eyes, stunning both men. In an instant, Harwick lunged. The fight that followed was swift, and savage fought across the boards of the Adelphi's empty stage. Cavendish, a man of letters and salons, was no match for the seasoned detective and went down hard. Hartwell, blinded and staggering, stumbled backward, still clutching the vial. His perfect control betrayed him at last. He tumbled into the orchestra pit as the glass shattered on the wooden floor. The vapor hissed into the air, and in seconds both men had breathed in the concentrated chemical meant for Harwick himself. What followed was chaos. Hartwell and Cavendish collapsed, overcome by the very essence of terror they had planned to inflict. The arrest of the two men shocked London to its core. Their trial at the Old Bailey in the spring of 1888 became one of the most sensational proceedings of the century. Before Mr. Justice Hawkins and a gallery crowded with the city's finest, the full story of the Laughing Man murders came to light. Expert witnesses described how Hartwell's formulas, far ahead of contemporary science, could manipulate human consciousness. In those notes shown to the court, he had documented experiments on human beings that defied every rule of medicine and morality. His vials able to produce terror, joy, and despair at will, while keeping the victim fully awake. The prosecution, led by Sir Charles Russell, described the defendants as the most dangerous kind of criminal men who had disguised murder as scientific progress. Cavendish's role proved as deep as Hartwell's. It was his money and reputation that made the experiments possible, his salons and connections that allowed them to select subjects. Even his death had been a trick, a feat of chemistry and theater that fooled a police surgeon. Evidence showed the two had worked together for almost 3 years, moving from theories about authentic emotion into the practice of live experiments. They had begun with the desperate students, paupers, vagrants, but soon escalated to prominent members of London society whose strange deaths would not go unnoticed. The city had been turned into a living laboratory, and the cost of their obsession was measured in terror and death. As their experiments advanced and their arrogance grew, Hartwell and Cavendish turned their focus to the very audience that had once applauded the doctor's theories, members of London's upper classes who had attended his lectures on human emotion. To them, these prominent figures were both the ideal challenge and the perfect stage upon which to showcase their beliefs, forcing the scientific world to acknowledge their work. After their capture, the chemical compounds Hartwell created were studied exhaustively by government chemists and medical authorities. But the results of those investigations were sealed into classified archives. Historians have long whispered that these early experiments with psychoactive substances influenced secret research decades later, even during the Boer War, though any official connection remains hidden from the public record. Hartwell himself did not escape the consequences of his own brilliance. During the final struggle in the Adelphi Theater, he inhaled a fatal dose of his own terror-inducing vapor. It left him in a state of permanent, unrelenting fear that no physician could treat. By the time of the trial, he was a broken man, trembling in the dock, barely coherent, often seized by uncontrollable panic that forced the court to remove him from the room. Cavendish fared better, though he too bore the scars of what had happened. He suffered episodes of panic and dread that plagued him, even as he gave testimony, coolly detailing their methods without a shred of remorse. His words revealed the cold and meticulous nature of their work, as if the suffering of dozens of victims was nothing more than an academic exercise. The case forever changed the way London police viewed crime. It was proof that murder could grow from scientific ambition as easily as from greed or rage. Harwick's methodical approach, his willingness to follow the trail of evidence into the heart of the city's intellectual elite, became a model for future investigations into educated criminals who used knowledge and status as weapons. His success earned him a promotion to chief inspector, but the cost was heavy. The experience left him with a lifelong understanding that the greatest dangers often come from those who appear most respectable. In the years that followed, he became one of Scotland Yard's foremost experts on crimes involving science and medicine, often called upon to consult on cases that defied traditional police methods. After the case, the Adelphi Theater underwent a massive renovation. Workmen discovered hidden rooms beneath the stage where Hartwell had stored his equipment and conducted some of his earliest experiments. There were records of every victim, lists of future targets, over 50 names of parliamentarians, judges, professors, industrialists, and artists, whose deaths would have shaken Britain to its core, along with letters to associates in other cities who had begun conducting similar work. The narrow escape that night had prevented a campaign of terror that could have engulfed the heart of the empire. The warehouse laboratory by the docks was far worse. Their investigators found acid baths and chemical tanks containing the remains of victims who had never been identified. It was evidence that these experiments had been going on for years, in some cases, nearly half a decade. Several accomplices disappeared before they could be arrested, and evidence hinted that Hartwell's influence reached beyond London into other parts of Britain, and perhaps even abroad. Dr. Sebastian Hartwell was sentenced to hang, but the damage done to his own mind by the concentrated vapors was so severe that the court commuted the sentence to life in Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. He died there less than 2 years later, his heart finally giving out under the strain of constant, unending fear. Geoffrey Cavendish received life at Pentonville Prison, where the former gentleman spent his final years doing menial labor. Prison records note that he suffered from recurring nightmares and sudden spells of panic. In 1890, he was found dead in his cell, apparently from natural causes, though fellow inmates reported hearing him laugh uncontrollably. In the hours before his death, a last ghastly echo of the crimes he had helped to create. The chemical formulas Hartwell had created were never fully reconstructed. Much of his research was deliberately destroyed to prevent others from using it, though some of the surviving notes were quietly locked away by the government. The case of the Laughing Man murders became a cautionary legend, a grim lesson on the cost of unrestrained scientific ambition, and its shadow helped shape the early ethics of modern medical research, forever warning that progress without morality can turn the pursuit of knowledge into something monstrous. Inspector Harwick's methods during the Laughing Man investigation became a turning point for modern law enforcement. His relentless documentation focus on motive and deep study of his suspects' psychological patterns reshaped how police approached complex cases. Within years, his case notes were distributed as required study material in training academies across the British Empire, teaching generations of detectives that the most dangerous criminals are often educated, methodical, and socially respected. The aftermath of the case rippled beyond the courtroom. London's elite, shaken by the revelation that their own intellectual circles had harbored a killer, were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that scientific progress was no shield against moral corruption. For the first time, Victorian society began to question the assumption that knowledge and social standing naturally produced virtue. Public pressure mounted for stricter oversight of psychological and medical research, sparking the first murmurs of ethical codes for experiments involving human subjects. The case became a cautionary legend about how ambition unchecked by conscience can transform discovery into destruction. Hartwell and Cavendish were not driven by greed or jealousy, but by an idea one they believed would benefit mankind, even as they sacrificed innocent lives. In their own minds, their work was a gift to science. Yet their experiments proved that without morality, knowledge can become its own form of madness. Even now, the story leaves unanswered questions. Did the investigators find all of their victims, or are there others buried quietly by the fog of history? Their deaths dismissed as accidents, while in truth, they were subjects of Hartwell's hidden experiments. The documents recovered hint at a network much larger than the two men who stood trial, suggesting that the full scope of their crimes may never be known. What do you think? Were all of their victims discovered, or are their names missing from the records? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this tale of murder and science in gaslit London captivated you, subscribe to our channel, ring the notification bell, and share with friends who love history steeped in horror. The shadowy streets of Victorian London hold countless secrets, and we will be here to guide you deeper into the places where ambition and madness meet. See you in the next video. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.